Hello, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, as the day gives way to the quiet comfort of night, I invite you to walk with me through the memories of my life. My name is Ulysses S. Grant, and though history may remember me as a general, a president, or a symbol of victory, I was first and foremost an ordinary man, shaped by hardship, duty, and the unrelenting tides of time. That I was born in a small town in Ohio. In the spring of 1822, a time when the United States was still young, growing, and uncertain about what it would become. That I came from humble beginnings, the son of a tanner, surrounded by the scent of leather and the rhythm of rural life. I never imagined that one day I would command vast armies or hold the highest office in the land. I look back now, from the calm twilight of memory, I see a life filled with contradictions, courage and doubt, triumph and regret, war and peace. That I was not born a hero. I did not seek glory, but life, in its mysterious way, called upon me to face trials I could not have foreseen. That in the years to come, I would ride through battlefields drenched in smoke and fire, stand before nations divided by hatred, and carry the weight of leadership during one of the most difficult eras in American history. And yet, through all of it, I remained a simple man, guided by a sense of duty, loyalty, and faith that perseverance could heal even the deepest wounds. Tonight, as I recount these chapters of my life, I hope my story will not only speak of battles and politics, but of humanity, of quiet strength, of resilience, and of the enduring hope that even after the darkest storms, peace can return. So, if you're ready, let us begin, not with the general or the president, but with the boy I once was, in a small Ohio town, watching the sunset over the fields, unaware of the vast journey that lay ahead. I was born on April 27, 1822, in a small village called Point Pleasant, Ohio. My father, Jesse Root Grant, was a tanner, a hard-working man whose hands were always marked by the labor of his trade. My mother, Hannah Simpson Grant, was quiet, kind, and steady, the heart of our home. When I was still a baby, our family moved to Georgetown, Ohio, a modest little town surrounded by rolling hills and open sky. It was there that I spent most of my childhood, exploring creeks, climbing fences, and caring for horses, creatures I loved more than anything. From a young age, I never liked the sight or smell of the tannery. The hides, the chemicals, the endless work, it was all too much for me. I preferred the fields, the calm rhythm of nature, and the gentle companionship of animals. Even then, I wasn't loud or ambitious. I was shy, often quiet, and perhaps a little too thoughtful for my age. But I had one skill that everyone in town seemed to notice. I could handle horses like few others could. People said I had a way with them, that they trusted me. It wasn't magic. I simply understood that they responded better to patience than to force. That small gift would stay with me all my life, and in many ways, it would define how I led men in the years to come. School was tolerable. That I was never much of a scholar, though. I did well enough. I preferred practical things, how to fix, build, or ride. That I remember once, my father arranged for me to haul wood and goods for neighbors using our family's horses. I was barely a teenager, but it gave me a sense of independence, earning a little money through honest work. That my father was proud. Though we often saw the world differently, he was strict, always certain of what was right, while I tended to keep my thoughts quiet. He dreamed of big things for me, far beyond the life of a tanner's son. It was his idea, not mine, to send me to West Point Military Academy. That I remember when he told me, one evening at the dinner table, "Ulysses," he said, "the Army will make something of you." At first, I was reluctant. I had no desire to be a soldier. I thought of horses, farms, and peaceful days, not of war or duty. But he was insistent. He saw opportunity, a free education, a future, a chance to rise above our small-town life. So, in the summer of 1839, when I was just 17, I packed my few belongings, said goodbye to my family, and set off toward a place I'd never seen, West Point, New York. I didn't know then that the path I was taking would lead me through decades of conflict, honor, and heartbreak. That I still remember that long journey. The creak of the stagecoach wheels, the endless roads, the feeling of being both excited and terribly alone. I looked out over the Ohio River for the last time before leaving. I felt a strange calmness. Life, it seemed, was already guiding me towards something larger than I could understand. At 17, I was no hero, just a quiet boy with steady hands, a love for horses, and a heart full of questions about the world ahead. If I close my eyes now, I can still see Georgetown, the dirt roads, the small church, the old schoolhouse, and the fields bathed in sunlight. That it was a simple life, but it was the foundation of everything I would become. The lessons I learned there, patience, humility, perseverance, would serve me well when the storms of war came, years later. And so, with a letter of appointment in hand and my father's hopes behind me, I began the next chapter of my life, one that would test my courage, my resolve, and my heart. That journey began at West Point. When I arrived at West Point, I was just 17, small, quiet, and unsure of what my future would hold. The great stone buildings of the academy stood tall above the Hudson River, cold and commanding. To me, they felt more like a fortress than a school. That I was registered under the name Ulysses S. Grant, though that wasn't quite right. You see, when my father applied for me, he sent the paperwork through our local congressman, and somehow, in the process, my name, Hiram Ulysses Grant, was changed. That I didn't correct it. I thought it might cause too much trouble, and so, from that day on, I became Ulysses S. Grant, the name by which the world would come to know me. At first, I didn't like West Point. The rules were strict, the discipline constant, and I felt far from home. Cadets had to rise before dawn, march to formation, and study late into the night. Everything was ordered: how we walked, how we spoke, how we dressed. For someone as quiet as I was, it was stifling. That I wasn't a bad student, but I wasn't exceptional either. Mathematics came easily to me. Languages, not so much. I remember struggling through French lessons, wondering how they could possibly matter to a soldier. But in time, I found small joys. There was a kind of comfort in routine, and I discovered that I had a natural talent for horsemanship. The academy's horses were strong and spirited, but few could ride them as easily as I could. During my final year, I set a record for the high jump on horseback, a record that, I was told, stood for nearly 25 years. Horses, once again, became my refuge, a quiet reminder of home and of who I really was beneath the uniform. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the sun dipped behind the hills, I would sometimes walk down by the river and think about my family, about Georgetown, about the life I had left behind. Despite my doubts, I learned much at West Point, not only about tactics and engineering, but about discipline, endurance, and quiet strength. That I didn't know it then, but these lessons would serve me well in times of war, when chaos and fear demanded calm leadership. That I made friends, too, men who would later become both allies and opponents on the battlefield. Among them were William Tecumseh Sherman, James Longstreet, and George B. McClellan, names that would echo through the coming Civil War. At that time, we were just boys, laughing, studying, and dreaming of futures we could barely imagine. Life at the academy was not easy. There were punishments for every mistake, demerits for every misstep, but I endured. Slowly, the shy boy from Ohio began to find his footing. By the time I graduated in 1843, I ranked 21st out of 39 in my class. Not remarkable, but respectable. When I left West Point, I didn't feel like a soldier. I felt like a young man who had learned how to persevere. I had no hunger for glory, no thirst for battle, only a sense that life was taking me forward, step by step, towards something I didn't yet understand. As I rode away from the academy gates for the last time, I turned to look back at the gray buildings standing against the blue sky. That I didn't know whether I would ever return, but I felt a quiet gratitude for the discipline it had taught me, for the confidence it had given me, and for the man it had begun to shape within me. My first posting would take me far from home, across a nation that was beginning to stretch toward the west. There, I would find myself tested once more, this time not by books or orders, but by the trials of war itself. The Mexican-American War was waiting, though I could not have known it then. After I left West Point, my first assignment was with the 4th U.S. Infantry, stationed at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, a post near St. Louis. It was the first time I had seen the great Mississippi River up close, and I remember standing by the shore, watching its waters roll endlessly southward. There was something about that river, steady, determined, eternal, that reminded me of the path I was beginning to walk. Life as a young officer was slow at first. There were drills, paperwork, and long days spent waiting for orders that rarely came. The Army, in peacetime, could be a quiet and lonely place. But soon, the winds of history began to stir. In 1846, tension between the United States and Mexico erupted into war. Many saw it as an opportunity for adventure, for promotion, for glory. For me, it felt different. I was not drawn to battle by ambition. I felt uneasy about it, even then. But as an officer, I followed orders. My duty was clear. Our regiment was sent south under the command of General Zachary Taylor, a man of simple habits and firm courage that I admired him. He was not one for grand speeches or pomp. He led by example, and his calm under fire made a deep impression on me. The first time I heard the whistle of bullets, I was surprised by how small and sharp the sound was, almost like the hiss of a bee. But soon, that sound became all too familiar. We fought in battles at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey, and later under General Winfield Scott in the long campaign toward Mexico City that I served as a quartermaster, responsible for supplies, food, and ammunition. Not the most glorious role, but one that taught me the importance of logistics and preparation. Still, there were moments when duty pulled me into the fight itself. At Monterrey, when supplies ran short, I rode through the streets under fire to deliver messages to At Chapultepec. I carried ammunition across an exposed bridge, refusing to take cover until every man behind me had passed safely. That I didn't think of those moments as bravery. To me, they were simply necessities, things that needed to be done. But those experiences showed me something important. Courage is quiet, often unnoticed, and rarely celebrated. War, I soon learned, was not the grand adventure so many imagined. That it was confusion, exhaustion, and loss. That I saw young men, boys, really, fall in battle. Their lives ended in an instant. The smell of smoke and gunpowder, the cries of the wounded, they stayed with me long after the fighting stopped. When the war ended in 1848, the United States had gained vast new lands, stretching from Texas to California. But I couldn't help feeling that something about it was wrong. That I had seen the suffering of both sides, soldiers and civilians alike. Though we had won, the victory felt hollow. Years later, I would write that I believed the war to be one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. That conviction never left me. When I returned home, I had seen more of life and of death than I ever expected. I had proven myself as a capable officer, yet I found little joy in it. Peace, not glory, was what I longed for. During my service, I met a young woman who would change my life. Julia Dent, the sister of a fellow officer. She was kind, patient, and full of quiet warmth. Everything my restless spirit needed. When I looked into her eyes, I saw home again. That in 1848, after years of separation due to war, Julia and I were married. It was a modest ceremony, but it marked the beginning of a partnership that would carry me through every trial to come. Those early years, the discipline of West Point, the fire of Mexico, the love I found in Julia, shaped me in ways I didn't yet understand. They prepared me for what lay ahead: hardship, disappointment, and the long road toward purpose. When I hung my uniform by the door after Mexico, I thought my days of war were behind me. That I had no idea that the greatest conflict of my life and of my nation was still waiting beyond the horizon. After the Mexican War ended, I returned home with a sense of relief, and yet an emptiness I could not quite name. The war had taken much from me: my peace of mind, my faith in easy victories, and a part of my youth that would never return. Julia and I began our married life with modest hopes. That we lived near St. Louis, on a small piece of land given by her family. That I dreamed of building a quiet home there, raising children, and living a simple life far from the noise of politics and command. But the peace I sought proved harder to find. That I stayed in the Army for a few more years, stationed in distant posts: Detroit, New York, and then California. Those years were lonely. The separation from Julia and our growing family weighed heavily on me. In 1854, while stationed at Fort Humboldt on the Pacific coast, I made a decision that would change everything. I resigned my commission. I left the Army without fanfare, without money, and without any clear plan for the future. I was 32 years old, with a wife, 2 children, and no steady income. Those were hard years. Some of the hardest of my life. I tried my hand at farming, selling firewood, and even working in my father's leather business. Each effort seemed to end in disappointment. I remember plowing the fields near St. Louis, watching the sky darken with rain, and wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. The soil was poor, the debts grew larger, and there were days when we had little more than hope to sustain us. I wasn't a man suited for business. I trusted too easily, managed too little, and disliked confrontation. The truth is, I failed more than once. There was a small cabin I built myself, by hand, with rough-hewn logs that we called it hardscrabble. It wasn't much, a single-room house with a fireplace, a few pieces of furniture, and a roof that leaked when the storms came. But it was ours, and in its humble walls, I learned humility in a way that no battle ever could. Sometimes, at night, I would sit outside, listening to the sound of insects in the grass, and think about the path my life had taken. I had once been a soldier, trained, respected, with purpose. Now I was a struggling farmer, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Yet even in those difficult days, I was not without blessings. Julia remained my greatest strength. She never complained, never lost faith in me. Her letters, her smile, and her quiet belief kept me from despair. In 1858, desperate to provide for my family, I accepted work as a clerk in my father's store in Galena, Illinois. It was not the life I had imagined, but it gave me stability, and for the first time in many years, a sense of peace. Each morning, I opened the shop, stacked hides, and kept the ledger. Customers came and went, never knowing that the quiet man behind the counter had once ridden into battle across the hills of Mexico. It didn't matter. I had come to believe that dignity could be found in any honest work. Looking back now, I realized that those years of failure were not wasted. They taught me patience, empathy, and resilience. They stripped away pride and ambition, leaving behind something simpler, a determination to endure. And then, just as I began to accept a life of quiet routine, history came knocking once more. In 1861, word spread that Fort Sumter had been fired upon. The nation, my nation, was breaking apart, north and south, brother against brother. I remember reading the news in silence, my hands trembling slightly as I held the paper. I had no thought of glory, no desire for command, only a deep sense that duty was calling again. The years of struggle had tempered me. That I was no longer the uncertain young officer of Mexico, that I was older now, quieter, and perhaps stronger than I realized. The drums of war began to sound once more. I folded the newspaper, looked out the window toward the gray sky, and whispered to myself, if there's a way I can help, I will. When the Civil War began in 1861, I was living a quiet life in Galena, Illinois, working as a clerk in my father's store. I had grown accustomed to ordinary days, opening the shop, greeting customers, spending evenings with Julia and our children. But when I heard that Fort Sumter had been attacked, something deep within me stirred. The country I had served, the union I believed in, was tearing itself apart. I felt a heavy pull, not of ambition, but of duty. I knew I couldn't stand by and watch. So I went to the local courthouse and offered my services. I told them simply, I have been a soldier once. I can be one again. At first, there was little enthusiasm for me. I had been out of the army for years. I had no connections, no political friends, no command. But Illinois was raising regiments, and I was given the task of helping organize them, to train men who, like me, had been shopkeepers, farmers, and clerks only days before. I watched them drill in the fields, wearing mismatched uniforms and uncertain expressions. I felt both pride and sadness. These were ordinary men, sons, fathers, brothers, soon to march into a war that none of us truly understood. In June 1861, I was appointed colonel of the 21st Illinois Volunteers. It was not a glamorous command. The regiment was undisciplined, poorly equipped, and restless. But I believed in them, and slowly, through calm persistence, I turned them into soldiers. I found that leadership was not about shouting orders. It was about steadiness, the quiet confidence that others could depend on when chaos threatened to take hold. When I first led them into battle, I remember the moment vividly. It was at Belmont, Missouri, in November 1861. The air was thick with smoke and fear. I could see the confusion in my men's eyes. and I realized they were looking at me to steady them to so I stayed calm. I spoke softly. I gave clear orders, and when I saw hesitation, I rode to the front, showing them that I would not ask of them anything I would not do myself, that we fought hard that day. We took the enemy's camp, then were forced to withdraw when reinforcements arrived. That it was not a grand victory, but it was a lesson, my first true test as a commander. After the battle, as night fell and the gunfire ceased, I found myself sitting alone beneath a tree. The battlefield was quiet, except for the distant cries of the wounded. That I felt no triumph, only the solemn weight of what work truly meant. Still, word of my conduct began to spread. My calm under pressure, my unwillingness to panic. These qualities, people said, marked me for greater things. Soon after, I was promoted to Brigadier General. It felt strange. I had not sought rank or recognition, but life, it seemed, had placed me once again on a path I had not chosen but could not ignore. The months that followed were filled with uncertainty. The Union suffered defeats in the east, and morale began to falter. But in the west, along the rivers of Tennessee and Mississippi, opportunities began to appear. I was assigned to command operations there, where the great rivers served as arteries of the nation, carrying supplies, soldiers, and hope. I began to see a new way to fight this war, to move swiftly, decisively, cutting off the enemy's strength where it mattered most. At the time, few believed that I, a quiet man with no political backing, could make a difference. But I had faith, not in myself alone, but in the idea that discipline and perseverance could achieve what speeches and ambition could not. I remember writing a simple note to Julia before one of my first major campaigns. I am not eager for battle, I told her, but I will not shrink from it. That winter, as frost covered the fields and campfires flickered under the stars, I looked around at the men under my command, farmers, miners, carpenters, and I realized something profound. These were not soldiers by birth, but soldiers by necessity. And in their quiet courage, I saw a reflection of the very spirit I had always believed defined America. The war was only beginning, and none of us could see how long or terrible it would become. But I knew one thing for certain: I would do my duty, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the hope that, one day, peace would return. By the winter of 1862, I had learned more about command than I ever expected to. The war had hardened me, but it had also taught me patience. That victory seldom came quickly, and that courage was often measured in endurance, not aggression. My first major victories came at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. In Tennessee, it was at Donelson that I uttered words that would follow me for the rest of my life. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. Those words were not planned. They were the natural answer of a man who had grown tired of hesitation and delay. The victory at Donelson lifted the Union's spirits, and for the first time, people across the country began to know my name. But with recognition came criticism. Some called me reckless. Others accused me of being too quiet, too secretive, even too stubborn. I ignored them. I had learned long ago that a man does not lead by pleasing everyone, only by doing what he believes is right. Then came Shiloh, a battle that would haunt me for the rest of my life. 2 days of brutal fighting, thousands of lives lost, the field soaked in rain and blood. We held the field in the end, but the cost was terrible. When the reports reached the newspapers, they called me careless, accused me of letting my men die needlessly. The weight of those words was heavy, but I carried it quietly, because in war, every decision carries both victory and loss. Still, despite the doubts, I was given a new command, the task of taking Vicksburg, the Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was more than a city. It was the key that divided the Confederacy. To capture it would be to control the river, to split the South in two and turn the tide of war. But it stood high on cliffs, surrounded by swamps and rivers. Many before me had tried and failed. For months, I planned. I studied the terrain, the water, the supply lines. I made mistakes, several, and the newspapers were eager to remind me of each one. But I refused to give up. In the spring of 1863, I began a bold and risky maneuver. I marched my army down the western bank of the Mississippi, crossed below Vicksburg, and attacked from the east. A move few expected, and none had dared before. It was a gamble, but it worked. We fought battle after battle. Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, until we reached the city's walls. Then began the siege of Vicksburg. For weeks, my men dug trenches, fought in the heat, and endured hunger and sickness. The Confederate soldiers inside suffered just as much that we could hear their songs at night. Faint, weary, human. War has a way of reminding you that those you fight against are men just like yourself. On July 4th, 1863, after 47 days, the city surrendered. Vicksburg was ours. The Mississippi River, the great lifeline of the nation, was once again under Union control. That same week, far to the east, General Meade won victory at Gettysburg. Together, those triumphs marked the turning of the war. When word of our success reached the North, there was celebration in the streets. President Abraham Lincoln, a man I deeply respected, wrote me a letter. He said, "You were right, and I was wrong. You have done more than I could have hoped." Those simple words meant more to me than any medal or title. That I was soon promoted again. Given command of all Union armies in the Western Theater, it was an immense responsibility, but one I accepted quietly. That I had learned that true leadership was not about the noise of fame, but about the calm persistence of purpose. After Vicksburg, I continued the campaign south and east. That we fought at Chattanooga, high in the Tennessee mountains, where we drove the enemy from the ridges and opened the way into Georgia. Each victory brought us closer to the heart of the Confederacy, but also closer to the unbearable human cost of war. That I often thought of Julia during those long nights. Her letters reminded me that beyond the smoke and marching and endless orders, there was still a world worth returning to. She was my anchor, the quiet voice that steadied me when the noise of command became too loud. By the winter of 1863, I was weary but resolute. The war had taken much, yet it had also given me clarity. A sense that I was fighting not for conquest, but for unity, for the hope that one nation might endure. In early 1864, I received orders to travel to Washington. There, President Lincoln would entrust me with the greatest burden of all, the command of every Union army. The responsibility for victory and for peace would soon rest entirely on my shoulders. The Mississippi no longer divided our people, but the wounds of war still ran deep, and I knew the hardest battles, those for the soul of the nation, were still to come. When I was called to Washington in 1864, the war had entered its fourth year. The nation was tired. Our people had endured loss beyond measure, sons, fathers, brothers buried in fields far from home. President Lincoln, with weary eyes and a heart full of compassion, placed his trust in me to bring this terrible conflict to an end. He gave me command of all Union armies. It was not a position I sought, but one I accepted as duty. My task was simple in words, but heavy in truth: to defeat General Robert E. Lee and bring peace to the United States. I respected Lee deeply, as a soldier and as a man. He was calm, disciplined, and led with dignity, but I knew that only by breaking his army could the Union survive. Soft percussion begins, slow, like marching footsteps fading into distance. In the spring of 1864, I began what would become known as the Overland Campaign, a brutal series of battles through Virginia's forests and fields, the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, names that would forever be etched in sorrow. The fighting was relentless. Each day brought new losses, and yet, neither army could claim clear victory. I did not retreat. Unlike those before me, I pressed forward after every battle, determined to end the war by persistence, not by one grand stroke, but by steady pressure until the enemy could fight no more. Men called me the Butcher. They saw the numbers and thought me heartless, but I carried every loss with me, every name, every face. War is not about glory. It is about endurance and the hope that its suffering will one day bring peace. By the spring of 1865, Lee's army was broken, his supplies gone. He fled west, seeking to join other Confederate forces. I pursued him through the mud and rain, never letting him rest. It was not vengeance that drove me. It was necessity. Each step forward brought us closer to the end. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, near a small Virginia village called Appomattox Courthouse, my troops surrounded Lee's army. There, beneath blooming apple trees, the war that had torn our nation apart was ready to end. The music quiets, leaving a single piano melody, gentle and reflective. When Lee requested a meeting, I agreed immediately. Yes, I rode to the McLean house where he waited. I thought of the long years that had led us both to this moment that I wore my muddy field uniform. While Lee appeared immaculate in his gray coat and polished sword, that we shook hands. Two soldiers weary of blood, I began the conversation awkwardly, speaking of old times in Mexico when we had both served under the same flag. Then, gently, we turned to the business at hand. Lee said he wished to know the terms of surrender. I told him that his officers and men would be paroled, allowed to return home, and would not be disturbed by federal authority so long as they obeyed the laws and laid down their arms. They could even keep their horses to help them plow their fields when they returned. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. There was relief in his eyes and sadness, too. He signed the document quietly. When the papers were done, we stood. Lee bowed slightly, and I returned the gesture. Yes, he mounted his horse and rode away. My officers began to cheer, but I stopped them. "The war is over," I said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." That night, as the news spread through the camps, men on both sides wept. Some built fires, others shared rations, blue and gray together under the same sky. For the first time in 4 long years, there was peace. That a few days later, I returned to Washington. The city was alive with celebration, flags waving from every window. That I saw President Lincoln again, his face tired, yet shining with gratitude. That he spoke not of victory, but of healing. "Let us bind up the nation's wounds," he said. That I could not have imagined that within days he would be gone, struck down by an assassin's bullet. His death cast a shadow over every triumph, a reminder that even in victory, sorrow lingers. The Civil War had ended, but the struggle to rebuild our nation was just beginning. That I had seen too much to believe that peace would come easily. Yet I carried with me a quiet faith that forgiveness could do what force could not, and that the Union, though scarred, would endure. In the stillness of Appomattox, I felt no triumph, only gratitude that the killing had stopped, and that at last Americans could begin to call each other brothers again. The war was over, but for me, a new battle, one for unity, justice, and reconciliation, was about to begin. When the guns finally fell silent, I had thought my service to the nation was complete. That I wished only to return home, to live a quiet life with Julia and our children, far from the sound of marching boots and cannon fire. But peace, as I soon learned, can be as complicated as war. The country was broken, not only in body, but in spirit. Cities lay in ruins. Families were divided. The wounds of slavery and hatred ran deep, and healing them would take more than words or laws. In 1868, I was urged to run for president. I had no great ambition for politics. I was a soldier, not a statesman. Yet I could not turn away from duty when my country still needed me. So, reluctantly, I accepted the nomination. My campaign was simple, a promise of peace and unity. My slogan read, "Let us have peace." Those 4 words expressed all I hoped for. Not revenge, not victory, but reconciliation. When I was elected, I took the oath of office on a bright spring day in March 1869. As I looked across the crowd gathered before the Capitol, I felt the weight of history upon my shoulders once again. The war was over, but the true work of rebuilding, of forgiveness, had only just begun. The years that followed were filled with both hope and hardship. We sought to bring the southern states back into the Union and to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans. It was a noble cause, and one I supported with all my heart. But it was not an easy path. Hatred and fear still lingered. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in the night, spreading terror and violence. As president, I acted firmly, using federal power to suppress them, signing laws to defend those who had once been enslaved. It was not popular with everyone, but it was right. Freedom must mean more than words on paper. It must be protected by the strength of justice. I also believed in fairness and honesty in government. Yet, despite my intentions, corruption crept in, not from malice, but from misplaced trust. I valued loyalty deeply, perhaps too deeply, and some of the men I trusted betrayed that trust for their own gain. The scandals that followed, the credit mobilier, the whiskey ring, cast shadows upon my administration and my name. I will not deny those failures. They remain part of my story, as all human failings do. But through it all, I tried to hold fast to my principles: honesty, fairness, and a faith in the union we had fought to preserve. Foreign affairs brought moments of dignity and progress that we settled disputes peacefully with Britain through the Treaty of Washington and avoided what might have been another war, that we sought friendship with nations abroad while rebuilding trust at home. The task of reconstruction was enormous that I traveled across the country, seeing cities rising again, farms rebuilt, children returning to schools. Yet I also saw anger, bitterness that refused to die. There were moments when I wondered whether the union we saved in war could truly survive in peace. And still, I believed that time and justice would heal what blood and battle could not. During my presidency, I often thought of President Lincoln, his gentleness, his vision that I tried to follow his example, to lead with compassion rather than pride that he had once said, with malice toward none, with charity for all. I carried those words in my heart every day I served. When my second term ended in 1877, I felt both relief and melancholy that I was weary, not from war this time, but from the endless struggle to reconcile a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. That I left Washington quietly, without ceremony, and for the first time in many years, I was simply Ulysses again, a husband, a father, a man seeking peace. Looking back, I know my presidency was imperfect, that I made mistakes, as all men do, but I also know that I tried, with honesty and conviction, to do what I thought was right for my country. Leadership, I learned, is not about perfection or power. It is about faith that good intentions, even when flawed, can lead a people forward. And so, when I left office, I did so with gratitude for the chance to serve, gratitude for the soldiers who fought and died for the Union, and gratitude for the hope that America, though scarred, would continue to grow into the promise of its founding words. Liberty and equality for all. That I had lived through war and peace, through triumph and failure, and though my name would be judged by history, I hoped only that people would remember my heart, the heart of a man who loved his country and who gave all he could to keep it whole. After leaving the presidency in 1877, I returned to a quieter life, though not a peaceful one that I had hoped for rest, but life had more lessons yet to teach me. Julia and I settled in New York, seeking a place where we could live simply and together. Our children were grown, and yet the world still demanded care and attention. Shortly after, I faced a challenge I could never have imagined. That I had invested, trusted friends, and lost much of my wealth to financial mismanagement. Suddenly, the quiet life I sought became a struggle for survival. That I could no longer depend on my army pension alone. But even in hardship, I found purpose. That I began writing my memoirs, hoping to provide for my family and leave a record of the truth as I had lived it. Each day, I sat at my desk, often with the room dimly lit, my hand moving slowly across paper. That I wrote not to boast, but to remember the victories, the losses, the moments of doubt and courage. That my health began to fail as I worked. I had been diagnosed with throat cancer, a cruel illness that made breathing and speaking painful. Even so, I persisted. That I knew that completing the memoirs would secure my family's future, and that was enough motivation to continue. Writing gave me peace. Each page was a bridge between my past and the future. That I recounted the Mexican War, the struggles of early life, the horrors of the Civil War, and the responsibilities of the presidency. That I tried to be honest, neither embellishing nor hiding my failures. The work became a companion, a final mission I could carry out despite the shadows of illness. In those final months, I thought often of my life, the quiet boy from Georgetown, Ohio, the soldier in Mexico, the general in the Civil War, the president in Washington. I remembered each step, each choice, each moment of courage and doubt, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Julia, my unwavering partner. Gratitude for my children, who brought laughter and warmth to my home. Gratitude for the men I had led in battle, who taught me humility, loyalty, and the weight of responsibility. Though I would not live long enough to see the full fruits of Reconstruction or the country healed from its deepest wounds, I held a quiet hope that America would endure, stronger, wiser, and united. On July 23, 1885, as the sun set, I finished the last lines of my memoirs. I knew my time was short, but I felt no fear. I had lived fully, in service, in struggle, and in love. I had witnessed the heights of triumph and the depths of loss, and in the end, I could leave this world with peace in my heart that I look back and see a life shaped not by ambition, but by duty, perseverance, and quiet courage. That I see the young boy who loved horses, the reluctant soldier who learned patience, the weary general who learned mercy, and the president who tried to heal a nation. That if history remembers me, I hope it remembers a man who tried, truly tried, to serve his country and his fellow man with honesty, courage, and humility. And now, as the night falls, I close my eyes, content in the knowledge that I have done all I could. Life has been a journey, long, arduous, and yet full of purpose.